All right, stuff we need to talk about for Thursday. You got a bunch of stuff due on Friday. The quiz thing should be available now. If it's not, if you have some trouble, be sure and email me. I have an on-site conference that starts tonight, so Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I may not get back to you quickly on the emails. I should have time kind of late in the evenings to be able to catch up on that stuff. So you may not get very immediate feedback, but you're going like, yeah, we don't always. Anyway, ooh, sorry. I can't think of anything else that I desperately need to tell you that I haven't told you already. But yeah, somebody said they may leave early. You gotta go, you gotta go. I get it. But if you need something, let me know. And then next week, I'll start begging you to turn stuff in, your questions in each week, rather than all at the end, just so I can get the grading done fast. All right, let's look at some stuff. Oh, sorry, stomach. Thing number one, if I can find it, weekly question, just as a reminder. Civil rights movement for question 3, which I think we went over most of the basics of last time. And if you watch that video, that 30-minute, I know it's 30 minutes, but you log in 30 minutes late for this class, so you could have watched it then. But that video is really helpful for that question to show you some of the stuff that happened. However, you can certainly get that stuff from your book. And we talked about the impact of World War II, Double V campaign. We talked about trim and desegregating the military. You could talk about Jackie Robinson at Fort Hood if you like. You could talk about the To Secure These Rights report. You can talk about Brown versus Board of Education, Little Rock Central. You could talk about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. But I think if you leave World War II out of this, you don't talk about hundreds of thousands of African Americans participating in a global conflict, gaining leadership skills, being treated as heroes, which they were, and then when they come home, it's like, can't use this water fountain, and people want to go back to the racist way things were. They're just not in the mood to put up with it. And why would they be? Plus, they have skills, new skills, and new knowledge, because of, the military trains you up, gets you in shape, and, makes you a leader in a way that you weren't before, most likely. And then, of course, you see that not everybody does things the same way we do them in the United States, or did them during that time period. Also still true, countries and states do things differently. So different experiences, different training, different knowledge. And court rulings also help. And federal government starting to desegregate some stuff. And then question 4. During the 1960s, the U.S. had become a more open, tolerant, freer country. Defend or refute this statement, and you'll probably do both. So the defend is talking about how that's true. Refute. I've been having trouble talking all day. Refute is going to be talking about how that's not as true. So what I want, of course, same thing I want in all the questions, specific examples. So almost anything you talk about with the civil rights movements that are discussed in chapter 4. So, and you can talk about laws that are passed. You can talk about Great Society. You can talk about Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. Tons of stuff you could talk about that show that we're freer and more open, that kind of stuff. The feminist movement, LGBTQ movement that starts to emerge during this era, the Hispanic rights movement, there's lots of stuff, okay? As far as how it's not more free and open, you can talk about how some of those movements had more or less success. You could talk about how in the Vietnam conflict, we continued to draft people who were poorer. You could talk about poverty as a way that we're not, there's an attempt to end poverty, but, at the same time we're attempting to end it, we're also disproportionately drafting people who are poor. You can also talk about how people who pushed for a more open and tolerant society are assassinated in the 60s, and maybe talk about how the Vietnam conflict is a pushback against that in some people's opinions. It doesn't have to be your opinion. And you can argue, maybe fairly successfully, that it really was just a freer country completely. And certainly there's a lot of progress. Now here's a weird thing that students often say, and I need you to think about this before you write it. Sometimes people will write that, I'm just gonna say it, Martin Luther King Jr. ended slavery. I'm gonna go with a big no on that. I get that every year. No, that's the Civil War. That's 100 years before. Now, I do get that people were not equal. I get that, but it's not slavery. Slavery ends with the 15th Amendment 100 years before this. Now, there are lots of things you can talk about that Martin Luther King Jr. did. You could also talk about how King is more accepted than, say, Malcolm X. There are lots of things you can mention that show whether we're free and open, more tolerant, and certain things we were more tolerant of. Communism's not going to be one of them. So that's going to be a place that you could also have a little pushback, because the war that we're fighting in Vietnam really is about containing the spread of communism. So lots of specific things in there. Be sure to mention specific examples, names, dates, countries, places, events. You put them in order, it helps show cause and effect. And if you do more than list them, don't just put bullet points or a list of stuff. If you tell me how they're related or why they're important, then you'll get those 9 or 10 points that you guys want. So, all right. Questions or comments before we go on to the notes? All right. Let me find the notes for today. Where are the notes? Weekly questions. Where are the notes? There they are. Okay. All right. So I honestly don't remember where we were because I think we were in a different place than the other classes. So help me out here. Had we talked about SCLC, Bayard Rustin? I feel like we talked about these first 2 paragraphs and maybe not Kennedy. Am I right about that? Check in the chat, but you guys could say something out loud.
We started to talk about Kennedy. I'm not sure if we finished.
Okay. All right. So we'll talk a little. I'll try to be fast. It's hard for a history teacher. Okay. So Kennedy, he gets elected in the 60 election, closest election to that point in U.S. history. We've had 2 closer, and then this last one could end up being, somewhere in that area. But this was about 1% difference between winning and losing. Typically, our elections are, a little more decisive. And there was some controversy in this election, just like in several elections that we've had in U.S. history. And the country was fairly divided, just as, you see from time to time in U.S. history, maybe even today. But what you see is that the country kind of comes together behind JFK, who's pretty popular. He has some issues in his first year. You're elected in 60, you take office in 61, you're elected 1 year, take office the next year. His first international conflict is the Bay of Pigs incident. And again, I don't remember if I talked about this because I teach the same thing 3 or 4 times a week. But this was U.S. attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. The attempt was drawn up by the Eisenhower administration, inherited by the Kennedy administration. It's supposed to be an indigenous revolution started by Cubans to overthrow Castro. JFK's thought is if we provide the air support originally planned for here, then it's not going to look indigenous, which is true. So what happens is JFK decides to withdraw the air support. Everyone that we drop off at the beach of the Bay of Pigs gets captured or killed, pretty much everyone, mostly captured. And then we've got to ransom them. Kennedy's going to say he's not sorry he did it. He's just sorry it didn't work. Going to make him look kind of weak. After that, we are going to, JFK is supposed to meet with Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union. He goes to Berlin, gives a speech where he says, we're all with you, we're all pushing for freedom. And then he says in German that he's a Berliner, but says it perhaps improperly, and maybe said he's a jelly donut, but they knew what he was trying to say. And he pledges to spend like $2 billion more on defense. And then Khrushchev says, what do we even have to talk about then? Cancels the conference and builds a wall. So the Berlin Wall construction begins that year as well. JFK decides that one of the best things his administration, or a couple of good things his administration can do to help promote peace in the world and change the US image, away from looking confrontational and more to looking helpful, is to create the Peace Corps and Alliance for Progress. And Peace Corps, college kids, usually college graduates that we'll send overseas to help, usually schools or clinics or that sort of thing, but to help in other countries. And then Alliance for Progress, is the business version of that, where business owners will send money or equipment or people from their organizations to help build water systems or transportation systems or electrical grids, that kind of thing. So corporate version and individual version of sending people over to help. Okay. All right. Cuban Missile Crisis next, following year of the Kennedy administration. U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba recognizes that they are building missile silos, nuclear missile silos, that will be pointed toward the United States, 90 miles away from Florida. This is distressing. The way that Kennedy decides to deal with this information is to go on television and say the Soviet Union is installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. If they don't take these away, we will respond with the full force of the US military. So he essentially threatens global nuclear, as Khrushchev said, global nuclear missile war. So he will threaten, loses something in translation, I think. Then they start threatening each other publicly. The Soviets send their navy toward Cuba. We send ours toward Cuba. Cuba starts to notice that both the United States and the Soviet Union are willing to nuke Cuba to get what they want. So then Castro is going to figure out he's probably not as big a buddy to the Soviet Union as he thought he was. He knows he's not our friend. So Castro realizes he's in a really bad spot, that both countries are willing to destroy his to get what they want. Kennedy administration is going to negotiate privately while they threaten the Soviets publicly. Soviets will do the same thing. What we end up deciding is that we will withdraw NATO missiles from Turkey without admitting that we ever had NATO missiles in Turkey. The Soviets will withdraw their missiles from Cuba and publicly acknowledge that they have them there and they're taking them out. And we will make a public promise never to invade Cuba. This looks like a win for Kennedy, and he needed a win after Bay of Pigs, so it makes it look like he has been the stronger of the two leaders, which is, again, partly what he needs to save face, improve his situation. Khrushchev doesn't have to worry about that as much, because in the Soviet Union, the press is run by the state, so they're not going to print anything that makes him look bad. And, in his country, they're not going to get outside information. It's going to be hard for them to get. So he doesn't have to worry about looking bad in the press. They're not going to talk on television about how he was weak and had to give in to Kennedy, in a way that Kennedy would have to worry about. Now, certainly the foreign ministers who live in other countries may hear things, but they're not going to spread that information back in the Soviet Union, because they don't, because no one wants to get killed, so they don't do it. All right, so 13, this lasts for 13 days. This is possibly, it depends on who ranks these things, most dangerous crisis of the Cold War, probably the closest we got to nuclear war. People in Florida, pretty distressed. They put plywood on their houses. They do hurricane prep, because I guess nuclear war and hurricanes are pretty similar. But anytime there's a panic, people put plywood on their windows. That seems to be what we do. And then you buy up all the stuff. And we've done that recently. It's stuff like toilet paper and canned goods and bottled water, although they wouldn't have had bottled water. Well, no, they might have, but it would have been glass bottles. But all right. So behind the scenes negotiation, mostly led by Robert Kennedy. If you're wondering, does this change the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States? I'm going to go with pretty much no. The biggest change is that we install a direct line of communication between the Kremlin and the White House, so both seats of where the leaders' offices are. And that way they can just call each other up and threaten each other. They don't have to go on TV and do it. So, it makes the threats a little more private than public. All right, so not really a thaw in the Cold War, but a change. And Kennedy starts to think a little more about civil rights. In '63, some interesting, sad or good, some things happen. One thing that happens in '63 is the March on Washington. And that's the I Have a Dream speech march. So there's definitely more push for civil rights. You also have the assassination of a fellow named Medgar Evers, who you could also read about for your book review. He's the head of the NAACP in Mississippi and leads a really impressive voting rights drive to get a lot of African Americans registered to vote. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is starting to become pretty active. So Mississippi civil rights leadership is pretty prominent during this era. So after Medgar Evers' assassination, President Kennedy, who'd been very tentative about civil rights, he knew that if he pushed too hard for civil rights, it would cause a split in his party. So he made a public speech the day after Medgar Evers was killed, the summer of '63, and said, look, this is no longer a black and white issue. This is no longer a Southern issue. It's not even a US issue. It's a human issue, and it's time to solve this problem. So he promises to be more assertive about civil rights. Also, he's running for election the next year. I am not suggesting that he said it and didn't mean it. There's no indication that that's the case, but this is also the same year he gets assassinated. So he'll be assassinated in November of '63. So you don't really see JFK do a lot about civil rights, but you do see him promise to make changes toward the end of his administration, which turns out to actually be the end of his administration. Of course, he didn't know it would be, because no one plans on what happened to him. All right. So LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was his vice president. That's a fellow from Texas. Notice that he picks a candidate from the South to help balance the ticket, and Southern Democrats were not huge fans of JFK. That's understatement. Now, sometimes Southern Catholics were, but Southern Democrats, as a rule, were not. LBJ was really not very much like JFK. He's from a working class background. He didn't go to Harvard, somewhere close, Texas State, which is very much like Harvard. I say this having gone to Texas State, not Harvard, but assuming they're very similar. Trying to think, what's the coolest place I went to college? Probably Georgetown, which is probably a little more like Harvard than Texas State, but very close, just trust me on this. LBJ was a public school teacher as well, And everybody needs a public school teacher as president because, you know, we know how to run things. We know how to ignore ornery teenagers, or I think he taught younger kids. He had taught in a border school, border town school on purpose because he was concerned about the quality of education in poorer and segregated schools. And LBJ is a complicated guy because you're going to notice he's going to try to do a lot of things to end poverty and racial injustice. He also, if you look at things that he wrote and said, says some things that sound really racist. So LBJ, complicated fellow at best. From what becomes Johnson City, his family owned a ranch there. Okay, lots of stuff you could read about LBJ. There's certainly a lot of stuff available in this area. If Half Price Books is open, I don't even know. There's probably a whole LBJ section. You can probably find stuff online. He's interesting and worth looking at. Most of the time, people really appreciate the civil rights activities that he's involved in, less appreciative of the Vietnam activities that he's involved in, and somewhere in the middle on the let's end poverty stuff. Not that people didn't want to end poverty, but perhaps because some people saw it as effective and other people did not. Okay. LBJ had been a senator from Texas for about 30 years by the time he's picked to be vice president. So he's older and he has lots of experience at getting legislation through Congress. This is going to be a huge bonus for him because he will be, more than any other president than, say, FDR during the Great Depression and World War II, very successful at pushing his goals through Congress. My guess is you have not seen any recent presidents be terribly successful at that. I feel confident in saying you will not see a future president be very successful at that either, because the Congress is fairly divided. Now, LBJ's Congress was not all on his side, but he really used the legacy of JFK to help push through the let me try again, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So the civil rights legislation. There we go. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, here we go. Civil rights stuff. Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race or sex in hiring and in public facilities. So what you'll end up seeing is the women's rights movement and every other rights movement using the Civil Rights Act of 64 to help argue that they're being discriminated against, and they'll use it successfully. Freedom Summer follows that, which is a huge push in 1964 to get people registered to vote. Lots of people do, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, probably millions, to be honest. I need some numbers, don't I? And that will impact the 1964 election in a fairly profound way. So more voting in the South, more African American voting in the South, and you'll see those numbers increase dramatically by 1968. The Democrats will nominate LBJ. I know he'd been president before, but you remember it's because, he took JFK's place after the assassination and had been nominated as vice president. So now he's nominated as president. And then the Republicans will pick a fellow named Barry Goldwater, who is a conservative Republican from Arizona. He is also going to be, he's going to suggest the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam, and that may not be very popular. That'll be kind of an understatement. I'm not going to say no one thought it was a good idea, but fewer people than he anticipated, apparently. So. Excuse me. 1964. Oh, okay. I put a link in there to something called Living Room Candidate. I'm not terribly sure that I would be able to show you this campaign commercial I will try. I tried it in an earlier class. It wasn't the most successful thing that ever happened. Let me try again. The thing I'm not sure about is that you'll hear the sound. Go. But at least I can show you the site. So if you go to livingroomcandidate.org, one of the cool things about it is it has campaign commercials for both parties each year. And if you go all the way back, like you have all the years, and it even has 2020, so you can see all kinds of cool stuff. You can see really famous commercials. You can see stuff you never thought you would see. If you look at all the little thumbnails here, you can see there's clearly one about the KKK, which LBJ is going to be opposed to, and he's going to suggest that this has something to do with the Republican Party. And then he had the Civil Rights Act. So, but the most famous commercial of this era is this Daisy commercial. So that's the one that maybe I'll show to you. We'll see. It shows up here in the window. Okay. Can you guys hear that, by the way? This is where you have to tell me something. I'll start it over. Even if you can't hear it, you can watch it maybe. I don't think there's a way to caption it. All right, see how it goes. Okay. Sorry. So you guys are saying that you can't hear it, but my guess is you could see it. Am I correct about that? Maybe?
Yes, we could see it, but we
Okay.
can't.
Yeah. So what goes on? You really should watch it because it's only about 60 seconds long. Come on, give me a minute of your own free time. But what this, you've got a little kid who's counting flower petals. I trust that you saw that. And then it turns into a countdown for a nuclear weapons launch. And then you're supposed to get the idea that we, destroyed the little kid because of how violent and aggressive and that sort of thing we are. And then LBJ's voice comes in a voiceover and it says, "These are the stakes. We must learn to love each other or we will die." And then an announcer says, "Vote in the upcoming election. The stakes are crucial," or something really big like that. But it's one of the very, very first negative campaign commercials. So it tends to be considered the most influential campaign commercial of all time, which is why I feel like you have to look at it. Otherwise, you have not seen the most influential campaign commercial of all time. So do it. Just watch it later, okay? So you can hear it and that sort of thing. I don't know why you can't hear it through Zoom, but I don't understand technology. Anyway, this makes people a little nervous because maybe Barry Goldwater will nuke your kids. So he's painted as an extremist. The reason that the Republicans matter more probably that year historically is that Ronald Reagan gives the nominating speech. I think the speech is called A Time for Choosing, and people are quite impressed by Ronald Reagan. And the thought is maybe we'll see him again, which clearly we will. LBJ is seen as the more reasonable choice. There are some people in the South who start to vote for George Wallace, who's an independent candidate, and he's going to do the same thing that Strom Thurmond did. He's going to run on a segregation campaign, and he'll run as an independent, which is essentially what Strom Thurmond did as well. California, is a little more conservative and is upset about some federal laws that are starting to prohibit segregation in real estate, which is kind of a weird issue, where there's certain neighborhoods that are considered white, certain that are considered black, and some others that go by people's ethnic groups. And real estate agents won't show people houses that are in neighborhoods that aren't segregated by race. Now, they don't have a written policy about it. It's just what they do. It's kind of an unwritten rule among real estate agents. So that's going to be declared unconstitutional. And in California, it's going to say, look, you don't have the right to tell people where they can't live. So California is going to try to pass a statewide proposal that says it is okay to have essentially ethnic neighborhoods. So that should be a thought to you about how much California has changed over really a brief period of time politically. So I know you're kind of seeing some states maybe change politically over time, and Texas might be one of those. Hard to say. I wouldn't say that it is nearly as dramatically as people predicted it would be, but little changes. But California, you've seen a really big change over time. Voting Rights Act of 65, so after LBJ gets reelected, makes voter registration federal rather than state obligation. So what that means is states don't get to determine if there's a literacy test or some weird things that people have to do, procedures they have to follow to get registered. That becomes standard. Voter registration, offices have to be open certain hours, and all of that will be federally legislated. So if you don't do what you're supposed to do, there are legal penalties for employees who don't follow the law. And this will make it much easier for African Americans to become registered voters in the South. 24th Amendment will outlaw the poll tax, which will make it even easier for African Americans to become registered voters in the South. And Black voter participation continues to increase dramatically throughout the 1960s. You know, somewhere between 2 and 5% at the beginning, like 1960, to about 80% in 1968. Immigration reform in 65 as well. Hart-Celler Act says that immigration should not be based on national origins or quota. So you'll see increases in immigration from Latin America, not Mexico, parts of, places south of the United States that are not Mexico, the Caribbean and Asia. We still had continued to renew the Chinese Exclusion Act until this time. So you'll start to see an opening in Chinese immigration, not dramatic just yet because China was a communist country and immigration processes are challenging, but you'll see changes that will continue to happen. Great Society, LBJ's plan to end poverty, also is initiated in this presidency, includes things like Head Start, Job Corps, Medicare, Medicaid expansion, creation of Medicaid, food stamps, commodities, anything you think of as a welfare program probably is created during this era, except I don't know if you think of Social Security as a welfare program. If you're not familiar with all of these programs, certainly they're described in your textbook. Head Start is school for 4 and 5-year-olds who might not be ready for first grade. During this era, kindergarten was not mandatory. If you had to qualify for the spots in Head Start, and that would be either because you're poor, your family's poor, or because your family does not speak English as their first language, and either of those things could make you less prepared for first grade, and that probably makes sense to you. Job Corps, if you didn't quite make it through high school, it can help you get your GED and specialized job training so you can make a little more money, maybe as a plumber or electrician or carpenter, usually a trade-related job. Not always, but usually. Medicare expansion and creation of Medicaid to give poorer people and older people more health care. Food stamps, literally, piece of paper that you could go to the grocery store and you gave those to the cashier, and in exchange for that, you got certain types of food. They don't do that anymore. They have like a debit card that you can use that's issued by the state. I think they're issued, I know that they're issued through the state government now. And also commodities. I honestly don't know if they still do commodities, but back in the day, you were poor on certain days of the month. You could go to social services office where you would get butter or cheese or eggs or milk. Those were commodities. So the federal government through the Department of Agriculture would provide those for you. Overall plan is sometimes referred to as the war on poverty. And people will argue the effectiveness of this. Now, the reason that you see this in this era is this is going to be the period where we have the lowest percentage of our population in poverty. So the thought is, this is the time to end it. But we're also trying to end poverty. At the same time, we're fighting a war in Vietnam. So complicated and expensive. And to do all of the things we're trying to do at the same time. Some people will argue that these policies were terribly effective. Some people will argue that they're less effective. Some people would say they're less effective because we don't spend enough money on them. Some people will say they're less effective because we make people dependent on the government. Some of the programs require you to be part of a nuclear family. When people say nuclear family, they don't mean it's explosive or anything. They mean that there's a mom, a dad, and some kids. Some of these programs require almost require you to be a single parent. So there's lots written about either of those requirements for these programs. Also, make sure you have a vague familiarity with Malcolm X, who's a little more northern of a civil rights activist. His phrase that you hear from time to time is by any means necessary. He's less of a peaceful, nonviolent guy. Member of the Nation of Islam, converted to those religious beliefs while he was in prison for a robbery, or not a robbery, a burglary that he committed. He and his best friend and their girlfriends robbed a wealthy house. I know houses aren't wealthy. The house of a wealthy person in Chicago. They got caught. The girls got probation. The women got probation. The men got, it was either 10 or 15 years in prison. The women were white. The men were black. It's, I think, the 50s, 40s. It's probably the 40s, yeah. And there's a ton of stuff I could tell you about Malcolm X, but I have 10 or 12 minutes left in class. And yeah, so you get to figure some of that out on your own. There's links in the review guide for the timed questions that can give you more information about Malcolm X. And I may talk about him more next class just because I feel sad that I didn't get the chance. Vietnam War, we entered this in '61 during the Kennedy administration, where we send advisors, about 20,000 advisors. It's a lot of advice. Clearly we're sending troops, but we send larger and larger numbers of troops. LBJ doesn't want to be the first president to lose the war. It doesn't look like things are going well, so he wants to escalate troop movement and follow a policy of Americanization, where we use American troops to fight the war rather than Vietnamese troops, which will lead to the desire to escalate troop numbers, which we will do. It is very important that you understand the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This happens in '64. It's an election year, which may or may not have impacted some of the decisions that were made. But we send the US Navy to the Gulf of Tonkin, which is in North Vietnam, perhaps not quite in international waters. They may or may not have received fire. They ask for permission to respond. It takes 3 or 4 hours before they get that permission. Then LBJ goes to Congress and says, look, these guys were sitting ducks. They didn't get permission to defend themselves for hours. We can't do this again. So we need to make sure that even though there's no declaration of war, that I don't have to come back to you every time we need something, so that these guys can get permission to defend themselves. So he asked for a resolution, which will be referred to as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that allows his administration, exactly what it says here, to use force as necessary in Vietnam without prior congressional approval or a declaration of war. So you don't have to go to Congress and say, can I spend this money? Can I do this? Can I do that? Now, we have clearly rescinded that idea in the modern era, and they do that because of what happens in Vietnam, because he has really this freedom to do whatever he wants without congressional approval. We will end up sending up to or over 500,000 troops by 1968 who are in country, and it'll dramatically increase the number of people that we are drafting. You'll also notice as you read through this section that there are enormous discrepancies in who we are drafting. We tend to draft people who are from the country, who are poorer when they are in the city, and that also necessarily means, just because of statistics and truth, that they are more likely to be not white. So we are drafting poor people and brown people in much larger numbers. Part of the reason is draft boards decide who gets drafted and who gets exemptions. And the people who are on draft boards tend to be well-connected sorts of people who make sure that their kids don't get drafted and their friends' kids don't get drafted. So Martin Luther King Jr. will lead protests against the draft for those reasons, and also because we're spending billions of dollars overseas to fight a war that we're not a part of, when we can't get our own government to enforce civil rights laws. And it's important for you probably to realize that some difficult things happen in 1968. In 1968, you have that escalation of troops to 500,000, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination when he's participating in the garbage workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee. Robert Kennedy gets assassinated after he wins the California primary. He actually gets assassinated while he's giving a public televised speech to thank his campaign volunteers. This will lead to riots in dozens of cities in the United States, including Chicago during the Democratic National Convention, where they decide to nominate Hubert Humphrey after LBJ had decided long before this, but certainly in 1964, that he wasn't going to run for re-election. Robert Kennedy was the leading candidate. He gets assassinated. Hubert Humphrey is his vice president. He's a pro-war candidate, which is why there's so much turmoil at the Democratic Convention. Plus, you've still got African-American Democrats who are arguing that they are not properly and fairly represented in their convention. And then you have the independent George Wallace, who is running on a program of segregation. So dang, what a mess. So you could add to that, because we will, something called the Tet Offensive, where people from North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, these are civilian soldiers, take over all the major cities in South Vietnam during a Vietnamese New Year celebration called Tet. Typically, both sides take a week off for that. In this instance, those soldiers, civilian soldiers, decided not to. Were able to overtake major cities in the South really just by walking in and doing it. They were undefended. And we have, there's video of that gets shown on the news. Now, those cities will eventually be retaken by the South, but by then the damage is done, because the country's leaders have been suggesting that we're just about to win the war in Vietnam, and then we see that on the news. So looks like we're losing in Vietnam. We are unfairly drafting people. There's 500,000 people fighting a war that we think has no point by this time we've started to come to that conclusion, even though at the beginning of the war, the country is very much in favor of it, which is why the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was popular in '64. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in '68, chaos at the Democratic National Convention where they call in the police who then beat up the protesters. I mean, it's a terribly difficult year. Nixon comes in as the Republican nominee and says, you know what? I will go to Vietnam and I will end the war kind of the same way that Eisenhower said he would. But he said, you know, we'll have a plan. He didn't say he would necessarily go, but he said, I will end the war in Vietnam with honor, and we will restore law and order in the United States, and I will speak for the silent majority. And guess what? Nixon wins. Other stuff, I have 5 minutes. Goodness. Other stuff you want to be familiar with. Feminine Mystique, which is a book from Betty Friedan that argues that women lose their identities once they become wives and mothers. They even lose their names, which certainly in this era was true. Not only did you take on your husband's last name, which I think is still fairly common, although people don't get distressed about it if you don't. You also kind of took on your husband's first name. So in that era, instead of, like, for instance, for me, when I got married, I took my husband's last name, which is Serna, which, you know, clearly I'm not Hispanic, but I think it's clear. But he was. So Jane Serna is the name that I go by. But in that era, I would have also taken his first name, so I would have been Mrs. Gabrielle Serna rather than Jane. So you really even kind of lost your first name. And then, you know, you didn't have a career as a rule. You might have had a part-time, you probably did have a part-time job if you were middle class. And if you were poor, everybody always works when you're poor. And then, you know, your kids become your top priority, so you really lose who you are. That book is going to argue not necessarily that you don't get married, although some people will take it that way, but that you keep your career, that you put if you want to have kids, that's cool, but put them in daycare as quickly as possible, and keep your own personal and professional identity, because that's how you keep your independence. I don't know any parent now that would tell their daughter, you know what, don't worry about college or a career, just marry a really nice man and he'll take care of you. You know, and they don't tell you, like my mother and her generation told me, just make sure you're attractive and sweet and that you cook well and someone will marry you and take care of you. Yeah, there you go. So you'll see some changes in the women's rights movement, in part because they adopt the Civil Rights Act of '65. Now, National Organization for Women will also push for changes in that way. On the weekly questions, somebody's asking, do you need to both defend and refute, argue for and against it? You can argue just one side if you want. I mean, that's fine. Typically, to make a good argument, you at least need to acknowledge the other side, which I am certain is not something that they teach you in high school, unless you're, well, not even in a debate class. So I would at least acknowledge there is another side, but that your side has the overwhelming evidence for it, okay? Court cases, make sure you're familiar with these 3 court cases, 2 of which you would have heard about in the Amy Coney Barrett hearings. Those 2 would be Griswold versus Connecticut, the case where the court says the state of Connecticut or any state, nor any state, can make birth control illegal. But that's a matter of privacy, maybe an extension of the 9th Amendment, but certainly the state doesn't have the right to do that. And then Roe versus Wade says that no state has the right to prohibit abortion in the first 3 months, the first trimester. Now you'll see states add some restrictions, who can pay for it, if people under a certain age have to have parental permission. Fetal heartbeat and fetal sonogram or sonogram kind of things may be added to that, but And Miranda versus Arizona, I assume that you're all familiar with this. The police have to read your rights to you when they arrest you because this Miranda fellow, this is his last name, he was a rapist. He got convicted of rape because he confessed. It was the only piece of evidence against him. He didn't realize he didn't have to confess. He had a really bad lawyer as well who fell asleep several times during his trial. He'll appeal the verdict for ineffective counsel, and he didn't realize he didn't have to confess. It'll get overturned, and that ruling turns into the Miranda rights. So if you're worried about him, he'll get arrested for burglary later on. He'll stay in jail for a decade or so and then gets deported. So he's off the streets. Okay, before we go, see if you guys have any questions, and I'll go ahead and stop recording. I think